Hi everyone and welcome to Introduction to Story Writing. And what we're going to look at in this video is we're going to look at the basic process for writing a story and the basic story structure. So what the basic story structure is how you can write a story from beginning, middle and end, and it is the best way to write it so it's interesting and that someone would want to read it. Okay? So let's start and look at really the three things it needs to have, which is an introduction, a complication, and an ending. So very briefly, we'll go into these more in a second. An introduction is where you start your story. A complication is where the problem in the story happens, and we'll go through that a little bit later as well. And the ending is where it all gets wrapped up, everything gets solved, and everything goes back to somewhat normal. It needs to have at least one character, and at least it needs to have an interesting idea or an event to describe. Those are the main things the story needs. Everything else in your story is up to your imagination. So you can start, every story has this sort of basic idea in mind. The rest is where your imagination comes in. And even if you're not a very creative or imaginative person, if you don't think yourself being very good at that, it doesn't really matter. As long as you have all these things, you have a story, and even your imagination, that will come into it later. All right, so we'll move ahead. Now, your introduction is where we'll start. And introduction is really just where the story begins. All right, it is where you tell us who your characters are. So where I say you set up your characters, it's where you introduce them. And the things that happen in their lives. So what their normal life is like. What every day looks like for that person or that character. And then you also set up the plot of the story. That is, you start describing their normal lives. So you start describing where the problem's going to come into it. So you set it all up and say, this is going to be, or this is this character's life, this is what he does or she does, and then you move from there. So we'll look at an example of it. Frank lived in a boring small town in the dry plains in the middle of Australia. All right, so we've got a very ordinary start here. He would spend weekdays building a highway for the government and would spend weekend at home with the kids. And finally, he liked his food and his television. So we know a little bit more about this person now. We know that his name is Frank, that he lives in the middle of Australia, that this is what he does. He spends weekends building highways, weekdays building highways and weekends with the kids, and he likes his food and TV. All right, very boring, it might seem, but at least we know who we're talking about. We know who this character is, and we're going to know a little bit about him for when we build on our story a little bit later. Now, this is only going to be a very brief story because we don't really have the time to go for a whole story here. But one thing about this story is that this is how you would introduce it. So you would start with something that is not always boring, not always very ordinary, but something that is a very sort of a lowish sort of start. We'll go for that later. Okay, so the next stage is a complication, and the complication is where the problem or the conflict starts to happen. All right, and I'll explain what that means. So a conflict or a problem in your story is pretty much the event where the normal life of that character has changed. Okay, so it changes and they must also change too. So something happens where what that person will do every day, or your main character or your main characters, so it doesn't have to be one, will change, so the story moves forward and we have something that now needs to be solved. And that's pretty much where the story, as I said, starts to go forward. All right, we start to move from something that happens every day to something that's a bit different and something that's going to be interesting to us as readers. It's where we learn a bit more about the person, object or event which changes that main character's life as well. All right, so not only do we have a change, we learn more about that change as well and what pretty much causes their entire lives to change completely. So this is what we're looking at in a complication, is not only a change happening, but this change continuing, so their life is completely and utterly different. Or it doesn't have to be necessarily completely and utterly different, but different enough where it becomes interesting and it becomes askew or different from their normal routine. So let me give you an example here. So while cleaning his boots, let's just say after a day at work, Frank was bitten by a spider. So this has changed his routine around. The spider's bite made his skin turn white and he felt an awful pain in his left arm. His wife pushed him into the back of a car and rushed him to the nearest hospital, which is 200 kilometers away. Okay, so now we've gone from something where he's living an ordinary life, doing his day job, coming home, and spending the weekend with the kids, to him nearly dying after being bitten by a spider. So here we've got the complication and we've got the results of that complication. Not only was he bitten by a spider, but we know more about what happened to him. So we know that it made his skin turn white, all those things, and he's now in hospital, or he's now trying to get to hospital. All right, so we've got the complication here and we've got some detail into that complication. All right, now we need to move on to working towards the ending to this story. And this is where the problem or conflict is solved, or it's solved in a capacity where the story can't go forward anymore. That the story as it happens has ended. It's often the most interesting part of the story when we get to this point, where we get to this resolution. It's often the most exciting part of the story. It is the part where basically the main character is able to stop the problem or conflict from happening, whatever situation that means. So whatever happens in the story where this problem or conflict stops, it doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad for that character. It can be both, or it can be neither, or it can be either or. But it means that whatever has happened to that character means that it's no longer a point, or it's no longer a problem anymore. It's no longer something that's driving the story forward. And at this point, the story can finish. So let's go back to our example, because this will probably help you visualize it a bit more. So his heart was in great pain with 50 kilometers to go. We're starting to get towards him. Each breath was weaker and weaker, so maybe he's going to die. He saw a bright light. He reached out towards it. He felt death touch him. He's really, really ill now. So we now know that this problem could be solved by him dying. This problem of a spider bite causing him to be dying may be solved by him dying. It's a bit sad of way of looking at it, but it's a way of solving the problem. It's a way of the story ending. Once he dies, the story can't go forward anymore. And then the next thing he saw was a doctor and nurse and his family. He felt no pain anymore. So not only do we have a bit of mystery in the ending, so we don't know quite what's happened to make him wake up and everything's okay again, but we know that he's got to the hospital, because we know he sees the doctor and the nurse, he sees his family, and he feels no pain anymore. So that's the end of the story. That's where there's no more problem. He's not nearly dying anymore. After he wakes up from there and gets out of hospital, he can probably go back to living his normal life again. So there's no more story there. There's nothing more of interest to us as readers, because we don't really particularly want to go back and follow his everyday life anymore, unless something else is about to happen which makes us interested again. So that's why we've got pretty much the beginning and the ending of the story from where we started, where he was living an ordinary life, to where the complication, the problem started, where he got bitten, and finally where the bite of the spider doesn't really matter too much anymore, and we've pretty much got an ending to the story right there. Okay, so in summary, a simple story really just has an introduction where everything's introduced, where we learn about who's going to be in our story, the complication where the problem happens, or the conflict, and finally the ending where that problem is solved. And that is the simplest structure you can use for writing a story, and the simplest way that you can write your own story. And that's pretty much it for introduction to a story structure and story writing. So until next time, I'll see you later.